next speaker is going to continue this conversation. Marianne de Klerk is also an MIT grad. She's an architect and an urban designer with 25 years experience working on a wide range of projects in South Africa, the United States, and Asia. She holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Pretoria, was awarded a Fulbright scholarship, and subsequently obtained 2 master's degrees in architecture and urban planning from MIT in the USA. She brings a multidisciplinary approach to her practice, with projects ranging from regional and urban revitalization initiatives to individual buildings. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Okay. Sorry, just give me a second. I just need to... There you go. Is that visible?
Yeah, looks
yes,
great.
You can see your
Okay,
presentation.
yes, thank you. My apologies, I had a bit of a problem with getting things to run on my computer today, so I've switched to the iPad. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this forum. Today I'm going to talk about homelessness in the inner city of Pretoria. And in order to understand that and illustrate how homelessness is being addressed, I'm going to look at the specifics, case study at the Akanani Homelessness Center in the inner city of Pretoria. And I'm going to contextualize it by looking at the historical and current spatial patterns and use of the inner city. Just, there you go. This is the historic core of Pretoria. This is a historic map just to show you the typical colonial grid that Pretoria developed on, and we are going to focus on this area, obviously, in a contemporary sense. Inner city in the 1950s, before apartheid was officially promulgated, is very important to consider because the changes has been quite extraordinary with the implementation of the segregation laws. Please take note of the 2 areas I'm going to focus on today: the Burgers Park, where the Akanani drop-in center is situated, and then Marabastad, which is just a historic settlement for Black, Asian, and colored people in the city, and how that was affected by special practices in South Africa with the advent of apartheid. Now, apartheid city model was developed in order to segregate people with the historic core, white neighborhoods around it, and then the buffers of industrial and mining areas, and then the townships for colored and Black Indian people on the periphery. And that model was very vigorously enforced with Pretoria as well. If you remember the Marabastad section that I referred to previously, this is an indication of how that area was, and it was a very vital, very lively urban area, was constructed over the course of a century through these forced removals and the destruction of urban fabric. People were moved to the peripheries of the cities. This area, this is Atteridgeville that I'm referring to, which you can see that to your left. Again, very much on the periphery of the city. You can see the industrial belts of Isco to the right, and then even if you go quite a bit then towards the east, you would have the historic core. So people had to travel long distances to get to work. Another device that was very effectively used in order to implement these policies were these modernist infrastructure projects. This project was never fully implemented, the Ring Roads scheme of Pretoria, but it was designed in order to destroy Marabastad, which you see at the top left. And that was very successfully fought by the Indian traders who managed to very cleverly utilize existing laws in order to keep their businesses. But again, these projects caused huge destruction and removed existing neighborhoods and communities who were not desired by the nationalist government at the time. The city also very rapidly modernized. You can see here, this is the center of the city, Church Square, in the 1930s. And then by the 1970s, it has become modernist, it's become monumental, and it's become this monofunctional modernist city that, structured by contemporary zoning laws. And this is just a view, a more recent view of the city today. So you can see there was a massive change in scale, but also in use, and it became a business district rather than a residential area. And this is something that has completely shifted since the advent of democracy in the 1994. Now, the inner city over that period in the 1990s started declining. It was mirrored by patterns internationally of inner city decline, but also the effect of things like sanctions and the flight of businesses from the inner city started to really take effect, with buildings becoming empty and upper floors not being used of buildings, only ground floors with retail. The city became a place of transience, with people coming to two train stations during the day, switching to the minibus taxis, which are so prevalent in that area, and then moving to their jobs in other parts of the city, with the city becoming a hub of government and then mostly transient workers. You can see here one of the cities, the Belombre station in Marabastad, and these areas also became magnets for homelessness. And you can see here mutual impacts from homelessness and the context, how these areas both degraded, were not being looked after, and as these areas became very empty, people moved in and started living there. Trade patterns also changed in the inner city with this advent of the new dispensation and the completely new residents living in that area. The inner city went from 90% white to 90% black. It was not only a place of business anymore, but became a place of informal trade. People started living in buildings that were not being used for business anymore, and the residential densities really became much denser than it previously were, as Brendan and Yasmin also spoke about. Just to give you an idea of the informal trading that complemented the formal trading in the inner city, and these all serve these new workers that transited through the city, but also a way for homeless people who very often made a living through this informal trade. Soft infrastructure is something that came to fore in this area to support all these new vulnerable groups who started to get a foothold in this new dispensation, started to give them support. This was mostly for religious and private groups who gave medical support, provided food for people, gave them their shelters, and that really started creating this whole infrastructural system to support this new, more vulnerable, newly arrived groups to the inner city. Another thing that's very important that emerged in this period is that there is very many schools, both the typical public schools and then private schools, which serve this new emerging middle class. And they took hold of existing buildings that weren't occupied by businesses anymore and established a number of private schools. And I'm going to show you one example, the Perea Park School, building definitely not designed for this purpose, but being occupied by a new educational dispensation that ran parallel to the typical public government systems. So a very entrepreneurial approach. As our case study, looking at the Akanani, we're going to focus on this park that you can see below, the Burgers Park, which is a very famous old historic park in the city. And you focused in here. And this drop-in center, which I'm going to explain to you now how that functions, is a place where homeless men are helped to take their first steps out of homelessness. It is not a residential facility, but it is a place of support. And surrounding this park, and this takes me to this argument that the urban system helps homelessness if it is correctly situated and managed. It is surrounded by a number of high-density apartment buildings, which are now much more densely occupied than before, but also a number of social facilities providing houses for young, vulnerable people, for women who are abused, social housing for people on the lower income scale. And those all work together to create an enabling environment to support homeless people. One of the organizations that's very active, and they also, the Tshwane Leadership Foundation, they also run the Akanani drop-in center, which is located in the park, are situated in that area with a red block. And they're part of the homelessness forum in the inner city. Half of the people who are homeless in Pretoria are actually in the inner city. So they provide support from these buildings. This is their headquarters. And then behind them is this facility called the Potter's House, where women in crisis with children who are escaping from abusive relationships are being helped, and they are housed here. So there is a larger network than just this one center that we're looking at today. Going back to the park and to Akanani, the center where the drop-in center is situated is here in the center of the park. I'm just focusing in. Here you can see it. It's an old historic pavilion that used to be a tea house, cafe, but the upper levels are now being used 2 times a week as a drop-in center for homeless men, and the lower levels have offices that support them writing CVs, working out independent development plans for them, and to help them to get a pathway out of homelessness. But this is, again, I want to stress, not a homeless facility. You can see this is being zoomed in. So people, again, they will be given advice how to take a next step. They will be given food and something to drink. This is a religious organization, so they'll be required to take part of devotions for a short time in the mornings. But it's an incredibly pleasant space, and it's also part of a very active, well-maintained park. You can see the park here itself. It is very actively used. There is some crime in the evenings, but it's a vital center of the city, and it's very interestingly, for a larger reference, also the point of, because it's close to the station as well, the point of many protests marches in the city starts here and then goes to the union buildings. It's part of a very established routes, mostly because the park's probably very pleasant, but it has that sort of, as a center and a starting point for protest, it has that historic role as well. Active play area for children in the communities around it. And then just overall very pleasant and well-maintained. And for the US viewers who don't know South African public parks, this is quite unusual for a park in a very stressed area to be this well used, well-maintained, and to be quite safe. And interesting to be a point of the first step out of homelessness for homeless men. These homeless men are reached at night when people who are part of Akanani go out into the streets. They find homeless people sleeping on the streets, and in this case, men, and they invite them to Akanani in the mornings. And I haven't spoken to the gentleman who runs this center. He says he has never had issues where he's felt safe or he felt threatened by crime, because they are known to help people, so they are respected and left alone. And it's the same for doctors who dispense street medicine. Just to give you an idea, just to conclude, it is a dense, well-maintained urban area that's well occupied. Very much part of the inner city. This part of the inner city is more residential, and it's very well used. Now, I just want to briefly look at homelessness. I'm not focusing on this, but just a brief comparison to homelessness in the USA, which has, especially since COVID, really skyrocketed. Now, unsheltered homelessness is on the rise. More shelter beds added in response, but always like South Africa, and especially with these groups who are doing fantastic work, it's never enough. What they do work, but they just never have enough resources. What the US do have, which is not successful in South Africa so much, which barely exists with our shelters, there is a housing first policy where there are programs to get people into housing and to support them in it. But the first step to formal housing, which is the permanent supportive housing, is much more difficult, and that is more focused on people who have a permanent income. So there is, and this traditional method of transitional housing is in decline. And so there is quite a housing crisis in the US, but it's nothing compared to South Africa, where the one shelter that does exist, which is the Struben Street shelter we're not looking at today, is an incredibly dangerous, corrupt place to live in, and likely a very big fire hazard for people who know. That's recently happened in Johannesburg. It's unsafe buildings where homeless people are basically stuffed in and not looked after. That is the institutional response by the government. These organizations who look privately at is much more successful. Now, just to conclude, homelessness is not about providing housing, but it's to restore dignity to people. And an organization like Akanani does not provide housing, but it helps people to get out of this situation. And that's incredibly important. So what is also very important is the supportive urban context for Akanani. And this drop-in center would never work if it was on its own. It is supported by a much larger urban system that is inviting to it, but also a mostly private institutional and religious system that supports homeless people. And that's important. And that is the soft infrastructure network that I'm talking about. As an urban designer, I would like to say planning and urban frameworks really need to address this in their frameworks and to really deal with specific areas where it can accommodate homelessness. Not only to try and almost push people out of that area, which has been the municipality's approach, but to help them where they are, because they often work there and they just cannot afford housing. This is not about only drug use, but it is about people who simply don't earn enough to be able to afford housing. And that's why I'm saying, making the argument that Akanani presents a very good model for overcoming homelessness, but more facilities are needed, and we need to prioritize our funding towards these type of facilities. The answers is there, but the resources are not. And I'm going to conclude with that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Marianne. Marianne has given us a historic overview of how segregation was created, specifically in South Africa. And I know there are parallels with the US.